Achtung, the looks of YouTube. It's me again, your Paladoni, and we're back again with another exciting episode of Let's Explain Victoria 2. Now, I'm really sorry about last month in advance, because I started that whole thing, and then my internet decided to completely crap out on me for weeks at a time, and even when it was up, it was literally the point where it could not be stable enough to actually upload a video. So, now that that period is finally over, the actual recordings can resume. Now, today's episode is going to be all about war. Now, I should preface this by saying I've already sort of had an episode about this before, once very long ago, and Let's Explain Victoria 2's history. In fact, I believe it was the second or third video I ever did for this series, but I never really went too much in depth with it. I always gave you the very bare basics of war, and really, to be honest, that's something I've always sort of regretted about this, is that I've never sat down and made a big long episode about the actual war, just because I could hardly find the way to actually explain it. But today's episode, we'll finally be going down in depth to the nitty gritty, every single little bit of war, talk about the technologies, the military units, naval warfare, and everything it consists of. There's going to be a lot. So, fact, at the very end of the episode, we're even going to have an actual war against Denmark. This will be the first time I've actually been to War in Victoria 2 live on YouTube. So, well, not live on YouTube, recorded on YouTube. If it was live on YouTube, it would be, I don't know, a little bit more exciting, I guess. But, so, the first thing, we're going to be talking about is the units, and I've talked about the units recently, actually, as recently as the Let's Explain Victoria 2 video for the Heart of Darkness release, but I think we need to talk a little bit more about the actual units, their actual stats, upsides, downsides, technologies, and etc. So, first things first, the irregulars, as always, and in fact even more so now in Heart of Darkness, now that unsafe countries can very easily get the infantry the infantry technology from their reforms. Irregulars are pretty much just completely, I wouldn't say completely useless, they're basically your militia. Cheap units, very expendable, very low attack and defense compared to other units, very low maneuver, max speed is not very good. Jump cut, sorry. But yeah, the max speed is nice, but it's not excellent, just average infantry speed. Just overall, the only upside to them is that they're incredibly cheap to actually make and put onto the field. If you are having terrible money problems, or you simply don't expect to have actual resistance for a while, because rebel troops are generally made of these as their bread and butter, you can invest in irregulars. However, I would at the very least keep one regular army around, as some form of defense is pretty much always necessary, especially for the kind of nations that would actually be making these things. The old benefit to irregulars is that they took a little bit less attrition in uncolonized territory, but I believe that as of Heart of Darkness latest patch, well, actually just Heart of Darkness, including latest patch, this is no longer the case, so they're no longer really more effective in the desert. They're just spam troops, I suppose. The biggest thing I would say about them to avoid this is, you may be tempted, if you have a whole bunch of unassigned soldiers in your nation, if you need some military score, to just spam these and put them in one big old army, that would be a pretty bad idea, because even as cheap as these things are, they give you no prestige to actually make. One of the very few units in the actual game that are prestigeless, along with the transport boats. So, these things are generally not worth your time unless your time is really short. But as you can see, even though their stats are just the worst, they only need 0.065 of a pound a day to pay for the supplies. So that's irregulars for you. Infantry are pretty much going to be your average, everyday, generic unit, especially now in Heart of Darkness that gods aren't just a straight upgrade from them. Infantry have balanced attack and defense, they have far better discipline than their regular counterparts, which means that they're going to just in general do better in combat. Uh, their maneuver is just on the same level as irregulars, which means that their actual combat speed is still good. Max speed is full kph, that's just your maps. Most of your armies will probably be moving about that speed. There's very little you can actually do about that except for some of the technologies in the military section will upgrade the speed of your entire armies, but won't actually affect them on a by-unit basis. So, that's lots of things said about infantry in general. Let's talk about the actual unit. Infantry is going to make up the brunt of your armies, simply put. First things first, all mobilized units turn into these things. Secondly, they're not expensive to make and are very good all-around units. Thirdly, technologies benefit them greatly. Fourth, the actual costs of goods are still not drastic. They're just small arms and canned food, and while those are a little bit more expensive than just wool for irregulars, it's these are still pretty common goods. I mean, Prussia starts with a small arms factory, and a lot of nations start out with a canned food factory. So even in the early game, it should be no problem actually getting these guys. They do very well in combat. They are a frontline unit, which means they're at the front of the actual two lines of troops. They make up the actual attack and defense bonuses you get. These are just all-around solid units. They have fair supply consumption that will be increased over time, sadly, but that's pretty much their only downside. They cost more money than irregulars, but are very much worth the cost, so there's not really much you can say about infantry. That's a lot that's a little in a lot of words, is what I'm trying to say. Infantry is just your number one unit you're going to have. Cavalry are a little bit different in Heart of Darkness. In fact, they're very different in Heart of Darkness. First things first, their primary good is now wool, but they still require wine for some reason. I've never actually got that. Their stats are very similar to the irregulars, just having a higher attack and maneuver, and a 1 reconnaissance mark. We're going to be talking a lot about reconnaissance once we start getting to the actual war, but for now, just know that's a good thing. Discipline is still 100%. Generally, even irregulars at this point are going to have 100% discipline. Yeah. The lower discipline is generally only a thing in Heart of Darkness that happens to mobilized armies, but can also affect irregulars in stock and AHD. So, they're faster, you notice, in infantry, have higher maneuver, but vastly lower defense and attack, and cost wine. But I still believe, yeah, cavalry are still cheaper. You might notice that even though I don't actually have the military plans, statistics, logistics, etc., and in fact couldn't possibly have that, we have all the cavalry now. This is not the military tab, which, as you can probably guess, means that cavalry are now basically the irregular forms of it, because all the other ones are unlocked based on your based on the first technology you get in what was formerly their entire branch. They are cheap units still. If you notice, not that much more expensive than irregulars. They have basic reconnaissance value, and their main purpose is to just bolster the ranks of your armies and to be able to capture and occupy sectors faster. If you, again, like with the irregulars, if you are having money trouble, cavalry are definitely the way to go for your actual mounted units. In fact, I would recommend these things in a lot more situations than irregulars, simply because the reconnaissance value they get is a lot better than irregulars. Just in general, I mean, that one little point of recon makes them better than all of these pretty much combined. It is very important in AHD, or in HOD is what I'm getting at. But still, if you're a larger nation, I would recommend delving into the actual advanced cavalry. Next is artillery. One man described these as a rich man's plaything, and they sure were right. 12 artillery, 12 canned food, 12 wine, and 12 alcohol, which means that these guys are pretty much in a constant state of being wasted. Not really a good thing for artillery, I would suppose, but they are still important units. Their actual attack and defense stats may not look very good, and their discipline, maneuver, and max speed are the same as infantry, but that little support thing you see is what makes artillery distinct in, well, actually in Victoria 2 in general, but especially in Heart of Darkness, because as you know, forever in Victoria 2, artillery fought from the second line, that is, the little line behind the infantry. And if you don't get what I mean, just keep on the line until the actual war, because I'm going to be doing a little bit of explanation about the actual front and back lines of combat, or first and secondary lines of combat. Artillery fights from the secondary line or back line of combat, which means that they're not actually in direct fire, generally. It also means, however, if they get caught alone, or if they do get pushed to the front line, they're not going to do very well because their stats are bad. But 200% support means that they are very good at actually bolstering combat for offense and defensive purposes. And they also, it doesn't actually mention here, but that also helps them out with doing occupation. Engineers, which I haven't actually unlocked yet, are support infantry, also fight from the second line, but aren't as effective fighters as artillery are from that position, are mostly for defensive purposes, as you can see. They have decent maneuver for some reason, higher max speed, basically I guess these are mounted engineers or something, but they also have one unique stat that's siege, and what that means is their ability to actually attack forts, and it's yet another stat that helps out with occupation along with recon and I believe support. And having one bit of siege helps out a lot. First things first, a fort in a province slows your occupation speed down, and of course gives defending units a fort level boost to their combat. The engineer will just nullify both of these bonuses with that siege. I don't know the exact amount of siege you need to basically nullify a fort, but it just helps. Simply put, it would be a lot better to invest in engineers than to try and take a very entrenched province with simply infantry and cavalry and artillery, but you have to discover muzzle-loaded rifles. I can't show you how much they actually cost, but the cost is pretty much in between infantry and artillery, costing small arms, canned food, and wine and liquor, I believe. Guards are vastly different now in Heart of Darkness. Probably the most changed unit, if I had to pick one. If not, they're a very close runner-up. Their attack is where they're at now. Guards are for the offense, simply put. On the defense, they'll actually get wiped out fairly easily. That's where the infantry now come in as general roundabout troops. And maneuver, combat speed, and max speed are still pretty low. But what this basically means is that guards are just your sword now. The other cavalry are not even as strong as guards. Even the cuirassiers, which is something I've never actually known how to pronounce, to be honest, they just can't stack up to these things. If you're going to be invading somebody particularly great powers, you need guards. Breech-loaded rifles is what you actually need to get guards, and it's quickly followed up by a technology that makes them a lot less useful. But the point is still, if you're going to attack, you really need these things later in the game. They help you out so much, it's crazy. And the best thing is the AI never really can... The AI always underestimates your guards a little bit, I think. They will stack up against your border in a defensive line with just infantry, or even worse, sometimes I see even just armies of guards, and they'll get cut down very quickly. The downside to guards is that they're one of the more expensive units to actually uphold. I do remember them being, basically the same as these guys, having small arms, canned food, iron, but also one of the liquors, I believe it's wine. So, guards are expensive, but they are very useful later in the game. Next is all the cavalries. We got the dragoons, the cuirassiers, and the hussars. I still don't know how to pronounce these. Please, if you're French, please do not make fun of me, or else I'll attack your nation. Anyway, so these three cavalry basically all fulfill similar roles in different ways. The dragoon is pretty much in the middle. It has medium costs, it has medium attack, defense, maneuver, max speed. Everything about them is very average, and now in Victoria 2, if you're going to make mounted units, your generics basically are going to be the dragoons, as opposed to cavalry like they were before. They are still a straight upgrade from cavalry with no real downside, as they were back in AHD and stock. Are fairly proficient in combat. Maneuver is still high, and as you can see, statistically they're going to be pretty much the same as infantry for a really long while, until the infantry start getting technologies that mounted units do not. So these things effectively act as just generic mounted infantry. They're pretty useful, just all around units, but I would actually only put these in your regular armies. If you want a cavalry army, or if you want multiple of them in fact, I would recommend having these two instead of dragoons. They're great support units, but that's pretty much where it ends, because they don't have the attack power to knock down units early game, nor do they have the reconnaissance values to capture points in a jiffy. So these things are useful for bolstering numbers of infantry, helping out in combat, a little bit in occupation, and in that purpose they serve that purpose well. But if you want an actual specialized mounted army, these are not the way to go. Cuirassiers are the more effective cavalry for combat, but lack recon at all. These are also good things to bolster your infantry with early game, but not for support, because these things are going to be essentially your early game equivalent to guards. These things are powerful early game, and the technologies are going to help them out a lot. They'll be a mainstay of your armies, probably. They still have the benefits of cavalry, having higher maneuver, max speed, but they are superior on the attacked infantry and equal on the defense. As I said, with dragoons, however, eventually this is going to change, because infantry is going to get some technologies that cavalry won't be able to get. So these will be the mainstay of an early game, but very rarely seen later in the game. And as mentioned, guards pretty much mark their extinction. So at which point they will probably be replaced with the hussars. Hussars are the lighter, faster cavalry. As you can see, they have lower attack and defense, but they have vastly larger maneuver and higher max speed than your average cavalry, or than your average dragoon or infantry. Their reconnaissance value is 2, which means that they capture territories really quickly. If you're going to make a cavalry-based army, I would recommend packing it mostly with these things. Not going to fare really well in combat, but they fare incredibly well with supporting by, say, having a smaller army draw a larger unit in, and then quickly getting these guys to the battle so the main army can arrive. They, of course, are good for hassling the enemy in their actual territory by kicking out smaller armies and forcing them into disarray. The downside is they are still costly. Small arms, canned goods, and luxury clothes, inexplicably. So they are a fairly expensive unit to actually maintain, and the supply consumption increases early on will make this a little bit worse. But these things are, let's just say if you have cavalry in the later part of the game, it's probably these things. Not so good in the actual combat, but they're better at the support that actual cavalry does. Tanks are, as I said in the Heart of Darkness introduction video, very expensive, but also very effective in actual combat. These things are pretty much a hybrid of your artillery and engineers, and though they're fairly slow, moving at the same pace as your infantry, and they need rare materials found at the end of the game, like barrels, they will be incredibly good for any attacking army, and the actual defensive and attacking capabilities of these things, especially with the technologies you get for them, are just insane. I've seen these things beat regular infantry in combat like 10 to 1. They are very effective, especially against lower technology units. If you're going to actually try and invade China, these things will make it just a nightmare for them. Essentially, late game, these things are going to be very important. So, a big thing I would say is try to get these things as soon as you can and as soon as the technology allows. The final unit on the list is the airplane. And as in the actual time period of the game, airplanes really hadn't actually spread their wings. Ha ha ha. And were not really so much used for actual combat. As you can see, their attack is paltry. Inexplicably, their defense is really good. I don't actually know why. That doesn't make logical sense to me at all. But they are good at support. Their maneuver is decent. But what is really important about planes is their reconnaissance values. These things let you occupy sectors incredibly quickly and will make wars go very fast if the combat is not just draining on you. These things basically replace your cavalry late game and are very effective units. So overall, you can pretty much... Oh, one last thing about airplanes. They also, like tanks, cost rare late game materials and are expensive to maintain. So, anyway, basically you can split your units up into a few basic categories. Your generic units, that's going to be your infantry, your dragoons, your artillery, your, well, 4, counting the irregulars with irregulars and cavalry. The irregulars with infantry, artillery, and dragoons. Your specialized units with engineers and hussars, as well as airplanes. And your offensive units with guards, cuirassiers, and tanks. So, that's pretty much your units for you. I've said most of those things in the past, but that's just a good thing for a statement. Now we're also going to look at some ships, because honestly, I've never really actually looked much into ships on the Let's Explain Victoria 2 series. The first thing we're going to get out of the way right away is the transports. That's going to be your clipper transports and your steam transports, and they are basically useless as far as actual naval combat goes. Their firing range is very small, they are slow, they are just not very good ships. The only thing they're actually for is for, as their name implies, transporting your units, which means that generally, even if you aren't focusing on the Navy, you're going to have at least a few of these in your flotilla. They are useful, but not for actual combat. They're really almost support for the land in every way. Next, you can split up the Navy effectively, and I'm going to do that before I start, into screens and capital ships. Your screens are your frigate, your commerce freighter, your monitor, cruiser, and that's it. And your capital ships are going to be your dreadnought, your ironclads, your battleships, and your dreadnoughts. Your screens are essentially just the how do I put this? They serve the battleships essentially. They have higher speed, and their mission is to essentially first scout out the enemy and find what they are, where they are, and establish targets. And secondly, in more defensive matters, they are to attack enemy ships that are attacking your battleships. And though it sounds like that's not going to be something that's actually emulated, that's just real life stuff, no, in naval battles, this is actually their function and what they're going to do from Heart of Darkness on. In AHD, however, these things are essentially just cheaper versions of your battleships with higher speed, so this is very much only for Heart of Darkness. So, your basic screen is the frigate. This is your sailing ship. Is made up of artillery and a clipper stock. They're very cheap to make, especially in the early game when clipper ships are made by everyone. They are generally effective for the early game, have a decent max speed, decent firing range and evasion. Your basic sailing capital ship is a man of war. These require a level 1 actual naval base in as recently as Heart of Darkness, and of course have vastly greater attack and hull. And I could sit here and explain the rest of these ships, but it's pretty much the same trend. The only things to note are the ships with the higher firing range of 60 will be the commerce freighter and the monitor, or not the monitor, the commerce freighter and the cruiser. The battleships and dreadnoughts, of course, also have higher firing ranges, which means that once you get into actual naval combat, these things are going to have a longer fire, as well as the ability to fire torpedoes, as held by the commerce freighter, monitor, and cruiser. These make it so that they have longer indirect attacks, which do some damage to enemy ships, basically as soon as they get into combat. So overall, just remember screens and capital ships. And honestly, generally, you're only going to need the most recent screen and the most recent capital ship. The only actual exception being I would not put monitors alone. I would actually throw them in with the rest of your units, because they're a little bit different from the rest of your actual ships. They're still screens, but they're like mini screens. So that's your Navy for you. So that was a lot of things to say about a lot of units. So now we're going to look again at technology. I know I already covered this in the Heart of Darkness first look video, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here. First things first is the Army Doctrine, which got slightly nerfed as of this game, but slightly buffed in a different way. These now all make your armies consume more supplies, and the only thing they actually do is increase your digging cap. The actual defensive bonus is from field fortifications, and if you notice, this is actually where the infantry-only technologies come in, because you'll see that uh, some of the units are excluded from the benefits of these technologies, and that's generally going to be your cavalry, particularly heavier cavalry. One thing to notice is that they make your engineers have more support later in the tree, and that is a very useful thing. It makes them a lot more effective in actual combat. So, if you're going military, this is still going to be your number 2 doctrine. And if you're going to be pretty much trying to defend yourself a lot of the times, instead of attacking, this is going to be, of course, your number 1 thing. Fort sure is always useful, even with the advent of engineers, and the later technologies you get are just crazy with what they do. So, still a good thing to invest in for your land military. Your light armament tree is still very important and still the most important thing on this screen, practically. There has been a slight change to the actual machine gun technology. It doesn't let you colonize anymore. That's breech loaded, but the actual invention requires machine guns, so it's still practically there. Well, actually, it doesn't require machine guns. It requires one of 3 things, but machine guns is one of them, so it's still require one of the possible requirements, I suppose. Armaments now require that you actually unlock the technologies to get them. They have a small chance of just naturally being unlocked, or if you're at war with somebody who's actually got them, you will soon adapt and try to outpace them by adopting them yourself, as long as you've got the prerequisite technology. Most of the actual technologies have been not very much changed, the only ones being the modern divisional structures technologies now have these new inventions for interwar infantry and cavalry that make them generally all around a lot more effective. Everything else is still what it was, slightly more attack, a lot more defense, and slightly more attack. The only exception being that the machine gun armaments don't just make your armies suddenly better at defense. The actual effectivity of them now varies from unit to unit. Infantry guards and engineers, of course, the ones that are going to be actually, trained and equipped with these things, get the most offensive bonus. The cavalry types are they get the least effect out of them from their another jump cut. Sorry, I'm gonna have a few of these to try and prevent things being in the background. So, as I was saying, cavalry get the least use out of these because generally they're not going to be able to actually, use them because they're sort of mounted. The cuirassiers, this is basically where their time ends because they barely get any added defense at all, and at that point, pretty much every unit will outpace them in that fact. And since guards already have the added offense modifier, that'll essentially mean that the only upside they have is slightly higher speed, and that's generally not going to help you out in actual battles. Irregulars also barely get helped from this, just because they wouldn't, they're irregulars, they're not really well trained, especially not versed in things like machine guns. Bolt action rifles still do what they do, change your unit appearance and combat width. All these change combat width, actually. In fact, they vastly change it a lot more than in Victoria to previous, especially the later technologies. So yeah, still an effective tree, still something I would recommend you invest in, even if you're not really planning on focusing on your land army. Your heavy armaments is still exactly what it was before, just artillery support. The only difference is the thing's technologies are slightly better, but it's still pretty much the same story as Victoria 2 was before. If you're investing in artillery, get it. If not, don't bother. Military science is where your cavalry used to be, and now has a whole bunch of technologies simply for making organization better and helping out your mobilization. These are pretty effective technologies in general. The aeronautics technology in particular has gotten a big buff. You might remember it before just unlocking airplanes and having a few inventions related to them. Now it has the most inventions of any technology in the game. These things are going to make your airplanes very good in the long run and activate early. So, if you're planning on getting much use out of airplanes, of course, go down this tree. And if you're planning on having a fearsome military, go down this tree, because the late game upgrades to the airplanes are going to help out your combat a lot, and of course, the organization is going to help you even more. And it still has the little known gas attack capability technology at the 1900 tech, which enables gas attack, which we will be, well, let's just talk about it now. It, these gas attacks basically massively, against countries that don't have the gas defense capability technology, do massive damage to them, and generally make any combat for them a complete disaster. It's slightly against that whole Geneva thing, but, morality. What's that? The final tree is Army Leadership, which gives you military tactics and morale increases. I have figured out what these things do. Military tactics reduce your actual combat losses, and morale basically slows the rate you lose organization, and is of course morale, and lets your armies take a little bit more beating before they go down to the breaking point. As with before, they still add organization, speed tax, and things like that, and are still very effective. But as I said, you really don't need to bother with these if you're not going to be focusing on your land army. Maybe throw a little bit of investment in these over time, but really, in the long run, if you're not massively army based, they're probably not going to be worth your time. The Navy technologies, I've never really covered these in depth, so this is generally going to be new stuff. The Naval Doctrine tree is going to be vastly more important now that naval bases are both required for building specific type of ships and increase your colonization speed, and especially because of course, you can only have one naval base per province, so you can't just have a million and build every ship immediately. So, instead of having a bunch of small naval bases, you're going to have a few centralized, more important ones. So, ensure that this technology is this is pretty much your main technology in the naval tree now if you're not actually going to be making many ships, because even if you're not going to be heavily investing into your navy, you need naval bases to keep up with the rest of the world, is simply put. So, next is your ship constructions. If you're actually going to be focusing on your navy, this is going to be arm in arm with Naval Doctrine in importance, because, as with Stock Victoria 2, every single one of these unlocks more ships. Adds more things to do your existing ships, and of course, your max speed bonus by default. So, these are going to be important. Even if you're not going to invest in Navy, this is still a good thing to invest in, because if you ever have to go to combat with an actual foreign power and need to actually get some use out of those naval doctrine things, or need to make a naval invasion, even if your doctrine isn't so good, you still can get a lot of benefit out of having the most modern ships. Naval engineering is where things start to peter off. This is pretty much, if you are going Navy, do it. If you're not, basically don't bother. What these do is it reduces the build time of your navies and adds armaments to them, which increase your general attack, except for your transport ships, and also for hulls on defense. And if you're going to be doing naval combat where you need every edge you can get, these are going to be really important for you. But if you're not going to be doing much actual naval combat, or at least you don't want to invest in this over army or industrial or other technologies, you don't really have to. It's a good thing to keep up if you're really outdated, because the AI will eventually all start researching this stuff, and eventually, if you get really far behind on doctrine, your Navy will suffer, but in general, it's not a priority tech unless you're Navy, in which case you really want to check it out. Same thing goes for naval science, which still does exactly what it did before, increases your supply range, and has techs that increase your organization. Pretty much a naval equivalent to the military science technology. This, as I said with that, is useful if you're going Navy. Don't even bother if you're not. Excuse me. But as with the engineering thing, and I guess to an extent as with science and leadership, it's still a good thing to invest in if you really are behind on them, especially considering you're going to get a crazy research bonus if you are. And finally, naval leadership, just as organization and as general technologies, and it's got the same story with it. So, with all of that said, let's actually get into some combat, shall we? Schleswig-Holstein. Oh no, I didn't call my allies to war. Be right back. So now my allies have been called in. Now it's a little bit more lopsided, as they've all joined the Prussian conquest of Danish Schleswig-Holstein, or as they say in German, Schleswig-Holstein. I've been railed on that before, and there you go, there's your pronunciation of it. Are you happy now? So, here is going to be our first display of might. We're going to start attacking the actual Danes. And as you're going to see very quickly, we are sending one army, the Fourth Corps, that is made up mostly of infantry with the occasional engineer and artillery, and one unit that is basically entirely cavalry based. So, as we can see, well, that is a massive amount of units, so let's just go and capture something else. So, we're going to have one here and one there, and there's Anhalt. Well, it looks like the Danes didn't actually put out their ships. As you can see, the cavalry captures so much faster than our army that's just infantry that it's not even funny. The only thing is, if you have a massive amount of infantry in a single province, you will eventually be forced out. Let's go ahead and add a little war goal to Denmark. Oh, I can't. I need more jingoism. Then let's see. Their navy is, which is the same as this thing, right? Okay. They will, for some reason, Denmark is just not trying to blockade me. I have no idea why this is. Yeah, look, there's a ship up there that's, like, trying to, but it's just not doing it. So I guess that means we have to do the shameful act of actually pulling our navy out to where they are before naval combat can actually begin. What a shame. Let's just get everyone ready here. I generally do not advise using transport ships in combat unless you have nothing else to do, like, well, I do. And the ships should be here immediately. So let's take a look at naval combat in slow motion, because this is the This is the more important, the more interesting and more changed part of actual combat. As you can see, every ship in Denmark is now effectively actually in combat. Their man of war and their 3 transport ships are now all actually doing something. Their man of war is attempting to approach my clipper transport and shoot it down. Their transport ship is attempting to encroach on my frigate, and their other transport ship is trying to get in transport-to-transport combat. This is not going to work out for them, however, as almost all of our ships are countering them in some way. So let's go on at speed of 3. Our transport ship has decided, their second transport ship has decided that what it was doing before was not in its best interest and is now seeking another target. Conversely, the brunt of our actual navies have spotted appropriate targets and are now attempting to actually engage in combat, including the KMS Brandenburg that is going after a transport ship. Frederick Ninsiet has approached the Golden Lova and is about to start combat. The transport ships have barely gotten into combat and have given up and are now retreating. These two transport ships are about to begin battle, and now they are doing so. They are just going to start firing at each other, as they are now man-to-man. But as you can see as well in my own ships, other ships are also firing at transport ships that haven't been able to actually come up to them yet, mostly the one that's still in battle. And they'll help out their friend by firing on the encroaching ship, which has been done, and the third transport flotilla has been sunk. However, in this time, the Frederick Ninsiet has attracted the attention of my other naval units, who are now all attempting to encroach on it. Even the Brandenburg now comes in and has now destroyed the target. The Danish fleet has successfully been eliminated. Let's move in for another battle. So, yeah, that's basically how combat works now. It's a lot more intricate. The ships actually choose their own targets, do their own things, and that one's trying to escape. We must pursue all the way to Greenland. Well, all the way to Iceland. If we are lucky, they'll slow down enough so that we can actually catch them off guard, though they seem to be retreating, so this looks unlikely. I apologize for the voice cracks. My voice is not in the top condition. At the very least, we're going to be able to show off the fact that the AI is a lot smarter now about retreating. They are retreating like hell right now because they now have the ability to, basically. Retreats can now go to any owned province. And the downside being, of course, that there's no way to actually seize this, but it does mean that you can actually retreat your ships to a proper port, and they won't just keep constantly getting smashed by ships that are just trying to destroy it before it can actually get home. As you can see, we're really far away now. Our supply lines are getting stretched, but at the same time, Denmark lacks a friendly port, so... Oh. This essentially spells the end for the Danish Navy, which means that they should be very conceding to our actual demands, and, oh look, they are. We have now acquired territory. But you still didn't see land combat, and, well, this is... Oh, I can't do that yet. Hold on a second. Tensions have flared in the Prussian Empire. With the seizure of Ulm, the Wittenberger king has responded with an almost immediate declaration of war. His local troops are superior, but Prussian reinforcements have arrived. This is the battle screen. There are a few things to notice here. First thing is these little numbers here all have a little bit of a meaning to them. Your first is your basic dice roll. That's generally how much damage your actual troops are doing, and affects how much the actual units attack the other infantry for. The other statistics are for your leader. If he's not any good, or if you lack one, like this army does, they aren't going to be doing very much good in combat. Things like your environment, crossings, which are which essentially mean that if you try to cross a river with units that are not prepared for it, they will give a penalty to the attacker, as it says. And lastly, the dig-in bonus, which is just how long the troops have had time to actually prepare for an attack where they are. So that's your roles. That's probably the most important thing on this overview, and if you need to find out why you're losing battles, or winning battles, this is generally where to look. Second thing is the actual line of combat. Troops are in areas that are assigned to them in the actual environment. These are planes, so they don't affect the actual combat at all. They assemble into two lines. First is the front or first line with infantry, cavalry, and other main attack units, infantry being primarily on the front, and cavalry being particularly on the flank. Infantry shoot at whatever unit they prioritize, and will generally prioritize by where they are and what other units are firing. For instance, the Ulm infantry, the first Ulm is right across from the 2nd Infantry, so the 2nd Infantry are taking the straightest shot they can at the first Ulm, which is going to help them out in combat for accuracy purposes. The Hussars, with their maneuverability, are a little less daunted about the fact that they have to actually aim. These infantry are doing a little less damage to the 7th than they'd probably like to, because they're not directly across from them, but are still doing an effective job because they're not on the very far fight of battle and trying to attack them. And the artillery, as usual, are just supporting and firing at any target that needs to be shot at. These actual squares there's going to be a lot more of them as time goes on due to your combat width. But let's throw in some reinforcements to make things a little bit more lopsided for them. As we can see, our first line is now directly facing the battle, as our secondary line is now moving in to support. The infantry are moving around to try and take an effective position for where they are, and they've won. And if we pursue, well, now we're under attack. If we pursue, we can see a more average invasion. Well, you didn't see very much of it because they died pretty much immediately. But you saw what a more average battle would look like, with the infantry and cavalry being allotted on the lines based on what the actual army is, and just generic positioning. So yeah, that's going to be the actual combat screen. There's a lot more factors that affect combat, mostly terrain based and technology based, but these are mostly common sense things. Like, if you're attacking troops on a mountain with a fort, it's not going to go well for you. So, I'm not really going to even bother to explain things like that because I'm not going to go that in depth. So, with all that said, make sure to make note of terrain in combat. If you're having trouble, look at your dice, and especially ensure that if you're going across a river or doing something like that, that at least you have good unit support or command. So, this concludes our episode for today. Next week we are going to be discussing something else. So, with that all said, I am signing off for tonight. I wish you good endeavors in your next wars. Good luck as well. And with that, good night, folks.